Good day, Thomas Jefferson Hour podcast listeners, and thank you for listening. We have a show this week where we answered a bunch of listener mail, and we're probably going to get a bunch of listener mail for some of the things we answered. But there was one that I didn't get into the show because we ran out of time. Can I present it to you now?
Of course, my friend.
It comes from Ken Walton.
Ken Walton.
And he says nice things. He said, "You've made Tuesday my favorite day of the week." Tuesday is the day that shows go up.
Oh, I hope that's
online.
what he meant. I hope he didn't mean it. Yeah, okay.
I wait anxiously for the next podcast during this week.
Wow.
I am now a proud member of the 1776 Club.
Proud indeed. Thank you.
And have started reading the book First Family,
which was the first book in our Thomas Jefferson book club.
Joseph Ellis was so kind to join us for a couple of shows. What a fun guy.
He's a good guy, isn't he?
And he says, and now here you go. And to be honest, I can relate personally better with John Adams than with Thomas Jefferson.
Oh, boy. Really?
However, I am interested in learning more about the relationship between Jefferson and James Madison. It seems to be more than just a friendship.
Indeed.
Is there a book on the subject that you can recommend? Plus, I believe it would make a great topic for the Thomas Jefferson Hour. And Mr. Ken Walton, I agree. I don't think we have spent enough time talking about the relationship between Madison and Jefferson, and he was pivotal.
No question. So there are a lot of new books on Madison and new books on Madison and Jefferson, and so we will read some of those, and we'll do a program soon, maybe a couple of programs on Jefferson and James Madison. I do want can I just be self-pitying for a moment? Really, Ken? After all that, you prefer Adams, really?
It seems to me that when we talked to Ellis, you talked about how you were getting more Adamsy as you aged.
I want to protect our man Jefferson to the extent possible.
And, I've stood here for years and been berated, called an Adamsite. Yeah.
An Adams, you are occasionally an Adamsite. But then on the other hand, you're sometimes Thomas Paine. And by the way, that's going to be our next book on the Jefferson Book Club.
Well, we have a couple posted. But
I just got a note from John Bowles. He won't be available till July, so we'll postpone him. Uh-huh. But we're going to do Tacitus's Histories. I know that makes you groan a little.
Yeah, that's a reading assignment, Professor.
It's a great book, and it tells you why the Roman Republic collapsed.
Thank you very much, Ken Walton, and I apologize for not getting this on the show, but it says on here, you listen to the show via podcast, so I'm hoping you will hear this. Thanks for listening. And, oh, by the way, thank you for supporting the show by being a 1776
The more the merrier.
member. And if you're interested in supporting the Thomas Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com, click on Donate. We so appreciate the support we get. We can't thank you enough. And it all goes into the show. You can donate to the show. It's tax deductible, or you can join the 1776 Club and get some extra content and know that you are on our favorites list.
Indeed. Well, no, and this program was out of character.
Yeah, we're going to get some mail.
Why?
Because we stood on both sides this week.
I will be so glad when Trump is no longer the pivotal question in America. Trump is irresistibly interesting. Whether you like him or not, he is one of the most dominant figures in modern life. His presidency is just chaos. We'll see if any of it works out, but it's chaos, and it has driven the establishment classes, all of the left, most of the media, even most of the conservative intellectuals of the country, has driven them crazy.
It was just a week or two ago, though, we talked to President Jefferson about his vision for America, and one of the things he said was that occasionally you need somebody like that to put the brakes on and make the citizenry say, well, where are we? What do we really need? I guess if I was optimistic, I would have to say, that's where we're at. Am I nuts?
No, I don't think Jefferson said we need Trump. I think he said we need to put the brakes on.
No, agreed.
Right, that's different. But yes, look.
If I misspoke, I apologize.
Look, what Donald Trump represents, let's just look at him for a moment at his very best. At his very best, he represents a deep critique of the way things have been going for the past 30 or 40 years in the establishment circles of this country. And he views it as non-productive, weakening the economy, not in tune with about 40% of the American people that he regards as forgotten Americans. He thinks it's made us weaker as an economy, weaker in the world's arena, and that our government is corrupt and out of control. That's his critique. You can agree or disagree with that, but that's an honest critique. And so if you read him at his best, he's trying to address that. Now, if I were trying to address that, Scott Pruitt wouldn't be around very long, but he has his own ways and means. It's the chaos that makes it so hard. In other words, I can see imagine if Donald Trump were a man of real decorum and civility and articulation, and that he wasn't bombastic and he didn't call names and he didn't parody people, but he was a serious critic of our policies in the Koreas, our policy in the Middle East, and so on. That could be healthy. And maybe what he's doing is healthy in its own kind of wacky way. I think we need to be careful I think we need to distill the craziness and the noise away. We need to take that fluff off the top and then actually examine the substance and see what could happen. What would America look like if some of those substantive critiques were put into policy?
We also answered questions, well, one from accusing you of using Jefferson to promote your personal political opinions. A very disturbing letter from a gentleman in New Mexico.
Well, he's the one who said that Barack Hussein Obama's name rhymes with Osama bin Laden. So I think he kind of revealed where his politics are.
We've got a couple of questions connected to West Point.
That was interesting.
Yes, and
then
also,
Madeline, remember the young woman who's going to William and Mary?
Really, you were so hard.
I was
on
great.
William and Mary.
I was right.
And then lastly, somebody who disagreed with your position on the Second Amendment, which is a very thoughtful and good letter. I hope we hear back from a couple of these folks.
So I want to ask as we close, the people who are listening, do you think that the time might come when the citizens of the United States might need to rise up in rebellion or revolution using such weapons as they have in their homes? Do you think that's a real possibility and a reason to adhere to protect the Second Amendment as it was written in the time of James Madison? Do you think that the moment might come when we actually do have to have a revolution and we need an arsenal in order to make that possible? These are not rhetorical questions. I really want to know what our listeners have to say. So, David, let us now listen to this program. A little bit hard on us, particularly me. I think there were a couple that were attacking you, but of course they didn't come up. But let's listen to the program.
You're right.
Let's listen.
Good day, citizens, and welcome to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with President Thomas Jefferson. Sometimes your weekly conversation with the gentleman who is seated across from me now, the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. Good to see you today, sir.
My dear friend David Swenson, the semi-permanent guest host of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, it is always a pleasure to see you.
You know, I thought I'd give Mr. Jefferson the week off. We've had some pretty interesting and heavy conversations with him in the past couple of weeks. We talked about a number of things. We had that long discussion about the hardest job in the world, the presidency, which was pretty fun to do.
Well, based on the article in Atlantic Monthly by John Dickerson.
We also had a long conversation with Mr. Jefferson about his vision for America. I always enjoy those, kind of going back to Jefferson's principles and what he really thought about the future of America and what his plans were.
You know, that actually helps to set up some of the things that we want to talk about today, David. So if you're accurate about Jefferson, if you portray Jefferson as Jefferson, he's a bit of a Tea Party guy. He's a libertarian. He's certainly for small government. He is suspicious of government. He's not a big lover of all the agencies and alphabet soup that we have in our time. There's a severity about Jefferson's idea of an American republic. He wanted farmers to be dominant. He wanted states and localities to be more important than the national government. And so if you distill all of that, this sort of farmer's paradise that he had in mind, isolationist, he wanted us to be a fourth or fifth ranked nation like China, I suppose he'd say he wanted us to be like Canada.
He could never imagine that the place in the world that America occupies today.
Nor would he like it.
He must have hoped at that time, all the founding fathers hoped for the success of the nation, but they really had no idea if it would survive or not.
Well, when you read these utopian novels, I don't know if you've ever read Ernst Kallenbach's utopia called Ecotopia.
I have not.
It's great. It's worth reading. It's dated now, but it's a book about what if California, Northern California, and Oregon and Washington and parts of British Columbia and so on seceded and formed their own little steady state Jeffersonian republic called Ecotopia. And the idea is that it's agrarian, people are gentle, there's no war, there's no military, there's commerce, but it's very green and environmentally sound commerce, somewhat of a barter economy that people read, people discuss. There's not a lot of aggression. There's no national aspiration except the maximum pursuit of human happiness, and that there's a deliberate break with all of the usual things that happen in great nation states and so on. There'd be no ICBM missiles. There'd be no cruise missiles, no SAC air bases, etc. You read that, and of course that's exactly what Jefferson had in mind. And it's easy for us to like shake our heads and say, "Great, sounds wonderful, never going to happen," or out of that, what kind of it's fiction. It's lovely fiction, but that's not how the real world works. I've spent my whole life hearing this. That's not how the real world works. But the question is, could we? And this is a serious question. It's not a rhetorical one, and I don't know the answer to it, so I'm asking it openly. Could we have been Canada? Could we have been a nation that has a very small military, a different attitude towards distribution of the fruits of life, a gentler, kinder kind of nation that didn't need to be the big gun in the world's arena? If we had wanted to be the sort of fortress, I hate to use that term, but the sort of isolated America that was super enlightened in every possible way, but was not interested in dominion or ruling the waves or building an empire or bringing resources in from all over the world, including at the end of a gun if necessary. If we'd forbidden ourselves to be the policemen of the world, would that have been possible? Could we have been America as Canada? That's the question.
I may date myself here, but I always think of a line from Silence of the Lambs. Do you remember that?
Yes, Jodie Foster.
Young Agent Starling is being berated by her superior, who is saying, "You can't do that this way. That's not the way the world works." And she responds, "I always kind of thought the world was what we make of it." And, maybe that's a bit corny, but...
No, it's not. It's like that line that Robert Kennedy used to quote. It actually comes from George Bernard Shaw. "Some men look on the world as it is and ask why. I look at the world that never was and ask why not."
I remember that. It's a great line.
But you take my point.
Oh, certainly.
Is it possible? And I'm asking everyone who's listening, just to we're going to pause for 5 seconds after I finish this. I know silence is deadly on radio, but I just want people to ask, instead of just reacting, which is what we all do, of course, I want you and everyone who's listening to just think about this for a minute. Would it have been possible for the United States to be a highly educated, enlightened, genteel, civil, thoughtful, artistic nation that refused to take its place in the world's arena, that became an exemplar of a kind of an agrarian, utopian enlightenment, and was content to be Canada or Norway or Finland or some other nation that is sort of not in the first rank and therefore is liberated from a lot of the horrible burdens of being of the first rank? Could we have been that nation? Is that a possibility? And I actually want to pause for 5 seconds.
Perhaps add into that, if any of our listeners can think of some examples where that could have taken place. I think of where we live and Lewis and Clark coming through and meeting with all the native peoples. What if we had sent artisans and teachers out rather than a military expedition?
Or what if we'd even turned back? at some places and said, hey, they seem to be thriving. We leave this part of America to them.
So you set yourself up for a couple of questions this week. I have a bunch of listener letters in front of me that I want to present to you. And there's a couple of tough ones. Are you up for it?
Like it or not.
Yeah. John Peterson wrote, and he listens in Garden City, Kansas, and he says,
One of my favorite places, by the way.
Mr. Jefferson, this is addressed to the president, but I thought perhaps you could answer it. Mr. Jefferson, why do you continue to allow your name to be used more and more to promote the personal political opinions of Mr. Jenkinson? This is not a recent development. I find this very disappointing. This has made the program very difficult for me to listen to overall. Would you like me to defend you, or would you like to defend yourself?
Well, I don't know that I want to defend myself, but I certainly will yield to you here in a minute. But I take this seriously. So the question is, what exactly are we doing here? Because
are you promoting your personal political opinions?
Well, one way to do this would be to be strictly in character, so that Jefferson can talk about Madison, he can talk about the Embargo Acts, he can talk about Napoleon, he can talk about a lot of things, but he can't talk about our world at all because he died in 1826, and therefore anything that comes after that moment that Jefferson wasn't in a position to see in his own lifetime, we simply refuse to talk about in the way they do, for example, at Colonial Williamsburg. That's a model of this that has a great deal to be said for it, and it's a safe model because, of course, we know a great deal about Jefferson, but we don't actually know what he would have thought of Franklin Delano Roosevelt's New Deal. We don't know what he would have thought about the moon landing in 1969. We don't know what he would have thought about race relations in Missouri or Charlottesville in the 21st century. So the safe thing to do, of course, is to say, well, that was then. Have no idea what's going on in your world. It's not for me to respond.
But Jefferson often says the world belongs to the living.
Indeed. And if I had done that, there would be no Jefferson Hour because, frankly, no one's going to tune in 52 hours per year or even 5 hours per year to hear a purely historic...
I think you underrate yourself, but I take your point.
No one is going to tune in to hear a purely historical articulation of that which occurred within the frame of Jefferson's lifetime. The reason why the humanities are important is because we have questions about the world. And those questions were begun for this country by Jefferson and Hamilton and Adams and Washington and Abigail Adams and a few others. And those questions turn out to be evergreen, eternal questions that continue to percolate through the country. That's one reason why the musical Hamilton is so incredibly popular, that the past is prologue and there are echoes and rhymes in history. And so the Founding Fathers are still relevant. The issues that they were wrestling with are issues that we continue to wrestle with. So if you agree with that, David, that there is some reason to project Jefferson forward, that we don't want to lock him purely into his world, then the question is, how can you responsibly interpret Jefferson for a world that he didn't live to see? And I think it's a fair question. And if in any way I have made Jefferson Clay Jenkinson's puppet, shame on me. What a pitiful thing that would be.
Agreed, but I really don't think you have. I would invite Mr. Peterson to write us with some specifics, perhaps even call us and talk to you about this. But I thank you for answering that.
But what do you think, my friend? Because I'm not asking you to defend us or defend me, but...
Well, I have watched you physically struggle, speaking words that Jefferson spoke that are so far from anything you believe, but you do it because you're an accurate portrayer. You're a humanities scholar, that you do things in the name of Jefferson that you would never do in your own name. So I think it goes both ways, but I do encourage Mr. Peterson to write us back and give us some examples.
And then if he will keep listening to the program every time he thinks that I've done this, I'd like a text from him or an email from him.
Yeah. Before we take our break, I'm going to reread a quote I presented to President Jefferson in a show, I think last week, and it's John Meacham from Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. The greatest men are spoken of and thought about because their ideas resonate and their battles recur. That's why we do the Jefferson Hour, isn't it?
No, he's spot on there. Is that from his biography of Jefferson?
Yeah, from Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power.
You know, he has been everywhere in the media during the past couple of months because of the troubles of the Trump administration.
So once again, John Peterson, thank you for your letter. We hope to hear from you again. If you'd like to contact the Thomas Jefferson Hour, go to jeffersonhour.com. You can learn more about the show. You can support the show. But right now, we need to take a short break. We'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm out of character today. I'm sitting across from you, of course, is the semi-permanent guest host of the Jefferson Hour, Mr. David Swenson. David, before we go on, I just wanted to say this much about John Meacham. I do not think that his book on Jefferson is the best possible modern biography of Jefferson, but I want to say this. His book on George Herbert Walker Bush is a fine book, and the Bush family is so pleased with it that they have asked him to speak at what I assume will soon be the funeral of George Herbert Walker Bush. Meacham is a gentleman, and he has been speaking out on national television about the current situation, not just the death of the Bushes, but also, of course, the chaos in the Trump administration. And he's so well-spoken, he has such dignity, he's so well-informed, and he is so careful about what comes out of his mouth. He's not a hothead in any way, and he doesn't come at this as someone who's like a knee-jerk critic of Donald Trump. He comes at it as a patriotic American biographer, and he has really, in my opinion, distinguished himself in the last 6 months.
I'd like to say something about John Meacham, if I might. I might take a little bit of issue with your review of his work on Jefferson. Now, when I read it, and again, this is Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power by John Meacham. When I read it, there were bits of it that I was a bit lukewarm about, but I found that it really ages well. As I go back to that book and we look up things that he's written in reference to discussions you and I might have, it's really grown in stature in my eyes, and I think you might want to reassess. It's not so much a biography as it is, for me, as a study of Jefferson, The Art of Power.
Well, his view seems to be that Jefferson was more comfortable with power than Jefferson likes us to know. And what I did find that I liked so much about the biography, and I will reread it now on your recommendation, is that he and his team of researchers found lots of actual information that I had never read before in any biography of Jefferson. So they did their homework. They found newspapers that I had never heard about. They found statements about Jefferson or letters that people had written to him. They really did some original collection of new material. And usually when you read a book like this by some prominent author who writes a lot of books, you're just getting the same material warmed over in a new voice. That's not true of John Meacham's Jefferson.
I have another letter that's a pretty tough one, but I want to present it to you. It's from Joe Bond, and the subject is the last most distinguished president. His message is, so stumbling across the radio dial on Saturday, April 21st, I land on a station 89.1 near the New Mexico border on I-10 eastbound. and I hear this very unique, distinguishable voice talking about Thomas Jefferson. I was floored by what I heard. You asked a question, who was the last great distinguished president? I was flabbergasted at your answer of Barack Obama. So please humor me and explain what is so greatly distinguished about Barack Hussein Obama. I mean, other than the fact that his name rhymes with Osama, as in bin Laden. I also find it somewhat ironic that a radio show about Thomas Jefferson is on a Spanish-speaking radio channel. Perplexing.
He's got lots of issues with us.
He does.
But the one that he says, when he says that his name rhymes with Osama bin Laden, he sort of gives away some of the game, right?
Yep.
But he's wrong about what I said, and I think you will back me on this. I have not said, I don't think I have ever said that Barack Obama was a great president. In fact, I give him some relatively low marks as president. What I did say, however, was when was the last time there was an elegant, well-spoken president who had deportment and civility, who really represented what a dignified person should represent while serving for 4 or 8 years as the president of the United States. I was not assessing the success or failure of the Obama administration. I have a long, complex view of that we could talk about sometime. I don't think it's very important. But I do not believe that I said that Obama was this great, distinguished president. I think his distinction is for a civility that we all now feel is sorely lacking in presidential circles.
Now, I may get myself in trouble here, but I am just, I don't understand why people are so hung up on discrediting Obama. He's not in office anymore, but the current administration, you can't go a day without somebody saying, well, we did it better than Obama, as if we're all holding him up as a standard.
You know, something that I heard, and I don't want to get lost here, but I heard this on CNN, I think, last week, and this was about the emerging negotiations with North Korea. And the person said to one of our major foreign policy experts, someone who has served in Republican and Democratic administrations, the question was, as you look around the world, what is the best way for foreign governments and diplomats and journalists and historians to assess what President Trump's policies are likely to be? You know what the answer was? Whatever Barack Obama did, he will do the opposite. And the person said, wait a minute, the President of the United States is basing his outlook, his tweets, his speeches, and his policies on what? The common factor is whatever Obama did, I'm doing the opposite. That's the zeitgeist and the philosophy of governance of the current president. It was flabbergasting to me.
Are you saying you think there's some truth to that?
Yes, I think that's exactly. I think the person nailed it. I think that I'll tell you exactly what happened.
Well, why are they so hung up on that?
Well,
I don't get it.
First of all, the right could never come to terms with Obama, and some reasons they had were good reasons. Some reasons they had were idiotic and occasionally racist reasons. Then Trump got involved in the whole birther thing.
Oh, yeah.
He made it his brand. He rose to national prominence as a political entity on the birther movement. He eventually said that he had been lying all along, but that's neither here nor there. That's what got him there. And so then remember at the gridiron dinner, the White House Correspondents' Dinner, when Seth Meyers was the comic, Obama got up and he delivered a couple of pretty sharp, sarcastic jokes about Trump who was in the audience. And if you watch that tape, David, and I urge everyone listening who's interested in this to watch that tape on YouTube, you saw Donald Trump melt down. And if you look at that, you can say, he has now decided that his life's mission is to get back at that guy who in public, in front of the whole nation, ridiculed him savagely for his complicity in the birther movement. That was the moment that Trump decided, I am going to undo this guy's presidency. Everything he did, I'm going to undo. His motive is that petty.
Did you hear that sound? That it was like a click. I think it was Joe Bond in New Mexico turning his radio off.
No, he's now sending me a text.
Oh, that could be. That could be.
But I'm just analyzing this. I'm not saying that I'm not praising Obama.
You know, we try to walk a line of fairness in the show, and I'm sure there are people who
Just
are
watch the tape.
Trump supporters who are very upset. But, you know, it was just a couple of weeks ago we had that heavy discussion about the hardest job in the world. And one of the things that you stressed that John Dickerson wrote in his article was that we have to wish for success for every president as citizens. And
I wish for Donald Trump's success, of course. But let me say one more word about this. I'm not making this up. Trump himself says that his policy is to undo everything that Barack Obama did in the course of his presidency. He admits this publicly all the time.
If true, that is frightening.
That's why I was so taken aback when I heard this, a distinguished Foreign Service professional saying, are you really looking for a way to understand what he's doing? Then look at what Obama did, and you can already decide what is likely to be the predictable Trump response to any given national or international situation. If that's true, that's deeply saddening.
Well, let's move on to secret societies, shall we?
You have one?
I have a question.
Oh, I thought you had a secret society.
Madeline Talnagi writes, I was just accepted to the College of William and Mary. And congratulations.
Dream higher, the University of Virginia.
No. Don't be that way. And wanted to ask about Jefferson's involvement in secret societies on campus. Did this influence the creation of societies at UVA? Are there any records of what went on in his society? I'm a huge fan of the show. Thank you. I'm so excited that I will be attending the same school as Jefferson. What say you, sir?
Well, he was in this pointless secret society. I think it was called the Flat Hat Club or something. And he admitted there was no point to it. And, of course, there are secret societies and the whole Greek movement, creating a sorority or a fraternity with letters out of the Greek alphabet. And it's kind of been washed down into kind of your stereotype of what the fraternal world is. I know that's not a fair stereotype, but these things existed. And, of course, there's Skull and Bones at Yale. There's the Porcellian Club at Harvard. And Jefferson was part of this secret society at William and Mary. He thought it was silly, frankly, and he was against all exclusive organizations. He did not become a Mason, even though he was a Freemason at heart, but he thought, no, a club that you have to be invited to join and that the average person cannot have access to, he didn't want any part of anything like that. And remember, he was so hard on the Society of the Cincinnati, the one that Hamilton and Washington cooked up as a kind of an aristocratic club of former Army officers. Jefferson said, no, in an egalitarian society, you want merit alone to be your ticket in life. And so if you and I, David, invite Chrysler to join our secret society, but we don't invite Madeline, that's not democratic. And so Jefferson, he was part of it, but he thought, oh, come on. And I urge this young woman to read 15 hours a day and let us know. Read 15 hours a day and then maybe transfer to UVA.
You're
Jefferson loved UVA, and he thought that William and Mary couldn't be saved.
Really?
Yeah, no, he tried to fix it. This is true. He was an alum. In fact, he said that the professor there, William Small, changed the destiny of his life, and he loved it. But then he wanted to make it better. He wanted to bring it into resonance with the Enlightenment. And as governor, he had the chance to sort of do it. And the board of readers or the regents or whatever they were called at the College of William and Mary said no, resisted. And Jefferson then was a bit stubborn when his ideas were not accepted. Jefferson said, fair enough, be what you wish. But then when his retirement came and he had the opportunity to create a replacement university in the center of the state, not in the Chesapeake, he did it. And created the University of Virginia at Charlottesville. And so he would, of course, say to this poor young woman, I hope you have penicillin if you're going to be in Williamsburg, because the malaria, the malarial, the heat,
I really
the swamps.
I hope we hear from
I would
William
like to.
and Mary. We should move on, but
malarial climate.
Can you also answer this? Are there any records of what went on in his society?
No, but you know what he also said.
So where do you come up with all this?
There's letters that he wrote about the Flat Hat Club. But he also said about the famous Wren Building. So the center of William and Mary is this famous building called the Wren Building. And Jefferson once said, and I quote, "But for the fact that there is a roof, it would be mistaken for a brick kiln." So enjoy your time there, Madeline.
You're just awful.
No, I'm
I've
just quoting.
Enough.
Yeah.
I have a couple of questions about West Point for you, sir.
Which Jefferson created.
Yes, my son is from Doug Reed. He said, my son and I just visited West Point. We were very surprised to learn that Jefferson is the founder. Since we never heard anything about this in all of your podcasts, and this doesn't seem consistent with most of his public positions, what's the story?
Well, we have talked about it from time to time, but West Point doesn't really advertise this in a big way because Jefferson was essentially a pacifist and he didn't like a permanent military establishment and so on. But Jefferson's Jefferson. So he looked at this when he became president and he thought, well, if you're going to have a military, as we do, you had better train these people to be engineers and to understand something about the history of strategy and to read your Julius Caesar and to read your Napoleon and to read this and that, your Alexander the Great. If you're going to have a permanent military establishment, you want it to be thoughtful, well-educated, well-informed, and disciplined. And the way to do that is to create an academy where you can professionalize fighting wars in the most intelligent and least destructive sort of way and learning from all of the history of battle so that we can make them limited engagements and not these kind of bloodbaths as much after his time World War I would become. So Jefferson did indeed create West Point because he wanted to professionalize the training of Army officers.
Again, this comes from Doug Reed and his son Brian.
Thank you for visiting West Point.
They write that they're regular listeners together. And they read Becoming Jefferson's People together.
My book about how we can be Jeffersonian, even though we don't necessarily like everything that Jefferson was.
And Brian found the podcast, and they went back and listened to all of your old shows, which means they didn't do anything for a year. Probably.
10 years,
Something like anyway, you found the show, you found the podcast. You should go to jeffersonhour.com, and you can find all sorts of information about Jefferson, about the shows, what's available, and by the way, you can support the Thomas Jefferson Hour there. So,
can I make another little point there?
I just want to say thanks, Doug and Brian Reed.
Yeah, that was great. They've taught us something, but if they had really listened to all the shows, they would have heard this once in a long while. But here's something interesting. When Theodore Roosevelt was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, he decided to make a book of all of the great things that every president had said about the Navy. You know, what Rutherford Hayes had said about the Navy and what Ulysses S. Grant had said about the Navy and what John Adams had said about the Navy and Jackson and so on. And he did it. That book exists. He had the hardest time finding anything positive that Jefferson ever said of the Navy because Jefferson wasn't a Navy guy. He thought that boats were rotted because they were made out of wood and they were expensive and they were a provocation to war and so on. He had very quirky ideas about Navy. And so when Roosevelt was writing this book, compiling this book of great statements about the Navy, he had to struggle to find anything in Jefferson that would do. And that's one reason, David, why he so disliked the third president. Roosevelt couldn't stand Thomas Jefferson, and one reason was that Jefferson was a theorist who thought that a Navy was a bad and expensive idea.
We're coming up on a break, so I'm going to hold this Richard Miles letter, which is a reference to West Point, until after we return. But you talk about Roosevelt a lot, and there are parts of Roosevelt that sort of remind me of our current president. Was he as berated in the press and considered as outlandish as President Trump is?
No. Because
I thought he got beat up quite a bit in the press.
He did.
And he was
impulsive. He could be a bully. He was bombastic. He was vain. He was egotistical. He thought he was the smartest man in every room. So there are ways in which he does resonate.
But he could back a lot of that up.
Yeah, here's the difference. He read a book a day. Let me say that again. Theodore Roosevelt read a book a day all of his life. And I don't mean any disrespect, but how many books has Donald Trump read in the last 10 years? Or for that matter, in the course of his life?
That's a question that would be good to get an answer to.
Yeah, well, when they asked him about the Bible, he said, "Let me get back to you." His favorite book, he said. Couldn't name a passage. Said, "Let me get back to you." But let me say this, a book a day, almost impossible to do. It is arguable that Theodore Roosevelt was the best intellectually prepared president in American history, and that includes John Adams, John Quincy Adams, and Jefferson. So
really,
the comparisons break down pretty quickly, is my point. But he was savaged by the press. They called him this bombastic bully. And he was, in many respects, that sort of a character. He had the same kind of a character set in some respects that Donald Trump has.
Well, that sort of leads into our next question that we'll get into after the break. But some of this bombast of TR worked?
Yes, the bully pulpit. But he was much more surgical about it, and he was infinitely more prepared to be a mature president of the United States. He won the Nobel Prize for ending the Russo-Japanese War.
Nothing like Jefferson, the mild-mannered, can't-speak in public kind of guy.
No, nothing stopped Roosevelt. He was one of the most powerful orators, and his ego, which is huge, he kept it in control mostly. But there was no question of his massive public self-confidence.
We need to take a short break, but we'll be back in just a moment. You're listening to The Thomas Jefferson Hour. Welcome back to the Thomas Jefferson Hour, your weekly conversation with or about President Thomas Jefferson. Seated across from me this week is the creator of the Thomas Jefferson Hour, Mr. Clay Jenkinson. And I alluded to another West Point question. Actually, it's a gentleman's uncle who learned a lesson at West Point. Richard Miles wrote into us, and he said his uncle learned that, quote, "It's better to make a wrong decision fast than make the right decision too slow." And he goes on to talk about America's effort to isolate North Korea and others to stop the proliferation of nuclear weapons.
Well, first of all, let me say that all of us should hope and pray, if prayer is part of your life, that our negotiations with North Korea end happily and that the president's approach is vindicated. I do agree with President Trump when he says, we've been at this for a long time, nothing's worked, let's try something completely different. I think he's right that the way we have gone about our long, agonized relationship, first with North Korea and second with Iran, has not necessarily been in the best interests of the people of the United States and not even necessarily been in the best interests of those regions. And so his view is nuts to that. I came in here to shake things up. I'm going to try something different. These are bullies. Maybe they understand that being counter-bullied is the right thing. You have to talk tough to these people, and I'm prepared to get serious about use of force, if necessary, to finally gain dominance over these rogue states. And you know what? Maybe he's right. It's not my cup of tea, but I'm withholding judgment, and he may vindicate himself, and if he does, we all have to say, you know what? There are different ways to go about greatness. There are different ways to go about presidential leadership, even national leadership. We have to keep our minds open. But as to the actual point from West Point, yes, of course, up to a point, do something. Don't just dither. Don't just sit around and negotiate forever. Do something. But do something can kill. Do something means a lot in a nuclear world. You know, if you push the button and say detonated a nuclear device over North Korea, 100,000, maybe 500,000 people would die instantly. There would be retaliation against South Korea.
There's another letter that's quite lengthy. I'm not sure we're going to have time to read the entire thing on the air, but it deals with the Second Amendment, a Jefferson watch that you recently did about the Second Amendment.
I have it in front of me, yeah.
It's from Josh Roy, and he says he loves the show, and he's been listening for over 6 years. He says in the beginning of the letter, I philosophically agree with what you said. It sounds nice and optimistic. However, I have to be a realist with atoms here. Do you want to tell people what you talked about in that? Do you recall that essay?
Well, really, all I was saying was that at some point we have to have a thoughtful, robust national conversation about the continuing validity of the Second Amendment. And my point was that a high-tech weapon in Jefferson's time was a musket, took 30, 40 seconds to reload. Today, the weaponry is just so much more quick and dangerous, and that this had to be factored in.
Josh Roy says that he's a 20-year veteran, and he would never trust that our military will always be on our side. It only takes a generation or two for a completely different picture to evolve.
You know, he makes such a good point here. He says, look, I get it what you say about the musket, but he said the government today has so much force that a semi-automatic rifle or even a machine gun might be what we need if we need to resist and rebel. And so he wants to keep alive the spirit of rebellion, that revolution is a natural right for people, which John Locke said, and says that, wait a minute, he says, you, Clay, are arguing that the type of weaponry really nullifies the purpose of the Second Amendment, but you're wrong, because today government is so powerful that we, the people, are going to need huge arsenals if we ever want to take on that government.
So you're granting him his point. Would you change your essay in any way?
Well, maybe I would. I would want to read it carefully, but I'll reiterate my point. I know that he will disagree with me, and Josh, I apologize. I do not think that there are conditions in our time under which the people of the United States would rise up in an armed rebellion. I don't think that that's any longer in their mindset. I don't think it's in the cards. I don't think that our government is tyrannical in any of the ways that would require that. It seems to me that we're talking about a theoretical possibility, and if listeners will just ask themselves, under what conditions would the American people rise up with their weaponry to overthrow the sitting government of the United States? I think the answer for me, and I may be a knucklehead, the answer for me is there is no possibility of that anywhere on the horizon, and that's not really any longer one of the tools that we have in our arsenal of protest.
He closes his letter by saying any kind of ban on guns will not stop this current trend of violence.
Well, I do think that if you banned all guns, first of all, there are more than 300 million out there, so you can't confiscate all of them. They're not going to be turned in, and it's not in our national interest to do that anyway. But even if you did, that wouldn't stop violence. Of course, he's right. It wouldn't stop violence. Violence is deeply woven into the American character. But if we had fewer guns, if we were more careful about who has access to guns, if we made sure there were universal background checks, if we banned certain types of magazines and so on, I think it's demonstrable that there would be less mass violence than there currently is. But I agree with him. That doesn't end the problem, but maybe it helps to get at the problem.
So thanks very much, Mr. Josh Roy, for writing the show. And I wish we had more time to talk about this. Perhaps we will in the weeks to come.
You know, David, I don't particularly have a strong opinion about this. What I'm asking for is a national, robust, thoughtful, evidence-based conversation.
Right, I recall. And men like Josh Roy should be part of that conversation.
His letter is part of it. It's a great letter.
Yeah. So we will call this conversation to a close, Mr. Jenkinson, because right now it's time for this week's Jefferson Watch.
The only way to save America, the only way to save your life, because you probably can't save America, is to turn your television off. I'll say it starkly. You cannot be a Jeffersonian and watch television. There are many drugs in the modern world: marijuana, cocaine, heroin, mushrooms, opioids, Ritalin, Prozac, and all of their more potent cousins, plus, of course, our old national standby, grain alcohol. It seems strange that the freest and most prosperous people who ever walked on the face of the earth are all strung out on one painkiller or mind alterer or another. What can be wrong that so large a percentage of us need to take something to get through the day? Truly, think about that. But those drugs are just baby aspirin compared to television. Get yourself a little 60-inch widescreen LEC high-resolution television, better yet, a home theater system, and all your discontentments will be over. You can throw away your OxyContin. If you went to the Koch brothers, or all the people described in Jane Mayer's important book, Dark Money, The Hidden History of the Billionaires Behind the Rise of the Radical Right, or whatever that group of global super-rich is that actually owns and runs the world, and yet lets us pretend we live in a democracy, and permits us the sweet illusion that every 4 years we go to the polls to elect people who care about us and might make our lives better. If you went to them, I say, and asked them to devise a drug that would be the American equivalent of the bread and circuses of the Roman Empire, or bear-baiting and public hangings of the 17th century in England, something that would deliver just enough sex and unlimited amounts of violence, plus car chases, dozens of sitcoms that work like Two Broke Girls or Two and a Half Men by way of nonstop sexual innuendo, something that would, A, take up the available non-work, non-sleep hours of the average American person, B, make them feel that whatever is wrong with their lives, absolutely whatever, can be fixed, the hole in their soul filled, if they will only buy X, Diet Coke, a Toyota, a newly electronically tunable mattress, a stair lift, a male body wash. Almost the entire strategy of television commercials is that if you buy X, Dos Equis, or a Land Rover, you are probably going to get lucky. C. Encourage them to eat processed food in giant quantities, artificially flavored food that will make them diabetic, as well as so sluggish that they are a little different from human zucchini. D. Dissuade them from getting out of that chair to talk to their neighbor, write a letter, attend a book club, take a walk, do yoga, make love with their partner, or actually read a newspaper, serious magazine, or book. And E. Keep them up an hour longer than they wanted to at night, so that by the time they finally rise off the couch, they just tumble into bed feeling numb and a little guilty, and then wake up tomorrow tired and not really thinking clearly. If you do all that, in other words, if you ask those ruthless runaway capitalists, what Theodore Roosevelt called the malefactors of great wealth, to squeeze all the Jeffersonian out of the American people, to alienate them from nature, so that you could go ahead and strip it of its resources with a minimum of regulation or reclamation or severance tax, to turn the American people into docile, hypnotically homogenized, brain-dead mere consumers, the people who actually run the world would of course invent widescreen, high-resolution television. Heck, we gave our souls to the TV back when it was pathetic, some grainy thing in a screen so small you had to squint, and you could only make out Kojak because he had a sucker in his mouth. We were addicted to TV when it was a weak and clunky distraction machine. But now that it is truly splendid, the quality of the colors alone, forget the content, the most beautiful and intense blues, reds, yellows, gold, is like the deep space LSD sequence in the film 2001: A Space Odyssey. You don't need to understand what's going on. Nothing is going on. You just sit with your mouth gaping open and let it have its way with you. Just turn on CSI Miami sometime, a pointless and moronic show about a smug carrot-topped detective and some extremely pretty lab assistants, plus female criminals that could have made a fortune modeling. And you will never want to write the great American novel again. The colors of those long shots of the Miami and Atlantic skyline are just so profoundly agreeable that they put all of your critical faculties to sleep. Turn off the sound on CSI Miami, and you will still be hypnotized, mesmerized, and reduced to nothing but Sigmund Freud's id. That's pure success for the television industry, and it's pure success for capitalism. Television. What killed the American dream? Television. What made us the second most obese people on the planet? Television. What made it possible for the military petroleum industrial media complex to invade Iraq, and soon Iran, to build a series of Abu Ghraibs, to betray every constitutional principle of American life? Television. If Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette had had television, they'd still be on the French throne. Napoleon would have been granted a Corsican reality show, nothing more. If the Romanovs had had television, no Russian Revolution. Imagine Mao Zedong giving up the Chinese Revolution to watch an NCIS marathon instead. Is there a pizza delivery in the Hunan province? You may think I'm joking. I'm not. Drive through the poorest district of your community, that disreputable trailer court known for meth trafficking, or through the projects, the commercially dead-seeming, bombed-out district on the edge of the city with furniture out on what used to be the front lawn, or through an Indian reservation town. You will see many things that make you sad. The most common thing you will see will be the flickering blue of television in almost every home. The revolutionary spirit that should be sending those oppressed Americans into the streets with pitchforks has been blunted by Wheel of Fortune. I'm not joking. I'm dead serious. Television is the ultimate capitalist drug. It cannot make you want to bring down your government, but it will make you want to take advantage of that new special at Olive Garden. Put it this way. What if some satanic being snapped his fingers and every television in America blinked off today and could never be turned on again? Ever. What would be the result? Well, first, of course, there would be riots in the streets, universal panic, dog killings, and domestic violence, and more temporary revolutionary outrage than if we had waterboarded every living Canadian, man, woman, and child. Think about that. Imagine if the satanic figure I'm talking about blinked out television during the second quarter of the Super Bowl. Now you'd see some AR-15s in the public square. Every school in America would have to set up special trauma centers for the parents. Forget the children. But eventually, the country would settle down and come to terms with the post-television era. And what would that be like? Imagine, for a moment, people would venture out into the streets and meet neighbors they have lived next to for 10 years and never had a conversation with. At first peevishly, but soon enough cheerfully, people would pick up books and magazines. Husbands and wives would have no choice but to start talking again, and maybe find a way out of the sullen ceasefire they have been hanging on to for years. People would seek time in nature, put their hands in the soil, start gardens, go walking, maybe even hiking. Our national health care costs would plummet if the American people walked even a half mile per day. They would sleep better, and their digestive systems would come out of the processed food coma they have been in for many years. Have you been to a Sam's Club? There's a probiotic section as long as a football field. People would begin to inform themselves about America, and they would be sickened by what they discovered. They would begin to demand more from their government, more honesty, more transparency, more attention to the environment, a more just and honorable foreign policy, and a living wage for every American. There would be no downside to the death of television, except to consumer capitalism. America would start being something remarkable again, and it would start one household at a time. The hobby stores would be mobbed. Or just look at it like this, my friends. Imagine what you could do if you had every hour back that you have spent watching television. You could have mastered the cello. You could have climbed every 14er in the United States. You could have learned to read Homer in the original Greek. You could have mastered all the spiritual positions of the Kama Sutra. You could have made quilts for all of your friends and loved ones. You could have learned to make outstanding Chinese food. You could have read the complete works of Mark Twain or Tolstoy or Dostoevsky. You could have read all the Greek and Latin classics in translation, and you could have written your great American novel. But no, there's Betty White making a wisecrack. Who could have guessed? Last night, after a very hard and emotionally exhausting day, I came home, made myself a bit of dinner, and then sat down in front of my television because I was too tired to read, too hepped up to sleep. I watched exactly 4 minutes. First I heard this. "Sir, do you expect President Trump to issue an apology?" I realized that I could have been watching Brian Williams at any time in the last 3 years and heard that identical question. I moved on. "LeBron from downtown." I moved on. Finally, "Ope, you're going to have to tell Mr. Johnson what you done there." So I went to bed and read for 2 hours instead. Do it, Jeffersonians. Reclaim your souls, and please report your findings to us here at the Thomas Jefferson Hour. I'm Clay Jenkinson. We'll see you next week for another exciting edition of the Thomas Jefferson Hour.
The Thomas Jefferson Hour is brought to you each week by Dakota Sky Education. The program is distributed nationally by Prairie Public Radio. President Thomas Jefferson lived from 1743 to 1826, and this program presents his views. President Jefferson is portrayed by the award-winning humanities scholar and author Clay S. Jenkinson. To obtain a copy of this or any past show for a $12 donation, please call 888-828-2853. Again, that number is 888-828-2853. This program is also available online at jeffersonhour.org and on iTunes. If you'd like to correspond with President Jefferson or submit a question for him to answer on the program, please visit the website at jeffersonhour.org. The Thomas Jefferson Hour is produced at Makoche Recording Studios in Bismarck, North Dakota. Music by Stephen Swinford. Thank you for listening. Please tune in again next week for another thought-provoking, historically accurate program through the eyes of Thomas Jefferson.